the 17th of October 1995, 4:16 a.m. A passenger train, number K204, was traveling through a mountain railway in southwest China. Then suddenly, it disappeared from the railway control system. On board were 108 people. They left behind no trace. There was no derailment, no explosion, no accident report. The entire train simply vanished, as if it had been erased from reality. But 3 days later, someone in the mountains said they saw it. That train. The lights were on. The doors were open. But inside the carriages, there was no one. 1 year later, the families of the missing passengers received a phone call. On the line, there was only one sentence: "We are still on the train." The 17th of October 1995. At 3:40 in the morning, a passenger train numbered K204 slowly departed from a small station in southwest China. It was a routine overnight train. Nothing unusual. The train left a mountain city and traveled north through a railway that cut across a series of steep valleys. On board were 103 passengers and 5 railway staff members. If everything went according to schedule, the train would arrive at its destination at 8:12 a.m. But it never did. At 4:12 a.m., train K204 entered an 11-kilometer mountain railway section. Local drivers had a nickname for this route. They called it Black Ridge Line. The terrain there was dangerous. Steep mountains, sharp turns, and constant signal interference. But according to the railway authority, the route was considered safe. At least it was supposed to be. At exactly 4:16 a.m., the dispatch center received a short radio transmission. The signal came from the driver's cabin of train K204. The message contained only one sentence. A sentence that would later become the most disturbing clue in the entire case. The driver said, "There's someone on the track ahead." Then the signal cut off. At first, the dispatchers were not too concerned. Seeing figures on railway tracks at night wasn't unusual. Sometimes it was a track worker, sometimes a nearby villager, and sometimes simply a driver's mistake. The dispatcher tried to contact the train again. The radio channel remained silent. At 4:20 a.m., they called K204 once more. Still no response. Now something felt wrong. They checked the railway signal system, and what they saw shocked everyone in the room. The signal from train K204 had suddenly disappeared. Not delayed, not weakened, but completely gone, as if the train had been erased from the system. In railway operations, there are usually only 2 explanations for a missing train signal. The first is a derailment accident. The second is a system malfunction. The dispatch center immediately contacted nearby stations. They asked if anyone had seen train K204. The answer was the same everywhere. No one had seen it. By 5 a.m., railway authorities realized something serious had happened. A passenger train carrying more than 100 people had disappeared on a single railway line, without a trace. At sunrise, the first search team entered the Black Ridge Mountain Railway section. A track inspection vehicle slowly moved along the rails. They expected to find obvious signs of an accident. Derailments leave destruction. Broken cars, twisted rails, debris scattered across the valley. But as the vehicle moved deeper into the mountains, something strange appeared. The railway was perfectly intact. No broken rails, no damaged sleepers, no marks from emergency braking. The tracks looked as if nothing had ever happened. The team began searching the surrounding slopes. If the train had fallen into the valley, wreckage would certainly be visible below. But there was nothing. Train K204 had simply vanished. The inspection vehicle continued forward. About 15 minutes later, the driver suddenly hit the brakes. Something lay beside the railway track. It was a black suitcase. The case rested quietly among the stones beside the rail. The rescue team stepped out of the vehicle. They opened it. Inside were only a few ordinary clothes. A jacket, several shirts, a pair of shoes. No identification, no ticket, nothing that could reveal the owner's identity. Even stranger, the suitcase showed no damage at all. If a train accident had occurred, it would not have remained so clean and intact. It looked as if someone had carefully placed it there. But this was a remote mountain railway. There were no roads nearby, no villages, no easy way for anyone to reach that location. The team brought the suitcase back to the dispatch center. At first, they assumed it might belong to one of the missing passengers. But that night, something far more disturbing appeared. The system logs showed a new signal record. Timestamp: 4:18 a.m. Exactly 2 minutes after train K204 disappeared. Signal source: train K204. But the transmission contained only fragments of sound. The technicians replayed the audio again and again. Finally, they managed to isolate one sentence. It was the driver's voice. He said, "That's not a person." Then the recording ended. The next day, a much larger search operation began. Police, railway authorities, and local government all became involved. Investigators started examining the entire railway line. But the deeper they looked, the stranger things became. Because they discovered something impossible. Train K204 seemed to have vanished from reality. There was no wreckage, no passengers, no physical evidence at all. The only things left behind were a single suitcase and a short piece of radio recording. If the story had ended there, it might have remained just a mysterious accident. But 3 days later, a villager reported something unusual. He said he had seen a train in the mountains. It was a remote village, about 20 kilometers away from the Black Ridge railway line. The villager explained that on that night, he had been herding sheep on a hillside. Then he suddenly noticed lights in a distant valley. At first, he thought it was a truck. But when he walked closer, he realized it was a passenger train. Every carriage light was on. Yet inside the train, there was not a single person. Police rushed to the location immediately. But when they arrived, there was nothing there. No train. No tracks. Not even marks from wheels. The villager kept pointing at the empty ground and saying, "It was right here. I really saw it." But everyone assumed he must have been mistaken. On the 5th day, investigators discovered something even more disturbing in the railway system. The signal of train K204 appeared again. The timestamp read 4:16 a.m. The location: the Black Ridge line. Exactly the same as the night it disappeared. Even more frightening, the system showed the train moving at 70 kilometers per hour, as if it was still traveling on the tracks, but in reality, there was nothing on the railway. Engineers checked the system. No malfunction was found. So they made a decision. The dispatcher opened the radio channel and called out, "Train K204, please respond." The channel remained silent for a long time. Then suddenly, a burst of static appeared. And after that, a very faint voice came through. It was not the driver. It was not a crew member. It was a child's voice. The voice said, "Don't come here." Then the signal disappeared again. From that day on, the railway system began detecting the signal of train K204 again and again. Every few days, the signal would briefly appear. The time was always the same, 4:16 a.m. The duration, 2 minutes. Then it would disappear, as if an invisible train was passing through the Black Ridge Line at night. Even stranger, several track inspectors claimed that during late-night patrols, they had heard a train in the distance, the rails vibrating, the sound of wheels grinding against metal. But when they turned on their flashlights, the tracks were completely empty. Then, 1 year later, in October 1996, the story took another turn. A family member of one of the missing passengers received a phone call. On the other end of the line, there was loud background noise, like the sound of a moving train. Then a man's voice said, "We are still on the train." The call disconnected immediately. Police traced the signal. What they found was chilling. The phone signal came from the Black Ridge Tunnel, and in the past year, no train had passed through that tunnel. Even more disturbing, when investigators replayed the original radio recording, technicians discovered something new. Hidden in the background was another sentence almost impossible to hear. They amplified the sound, reduced the noise, and processed it repeatedly. Finally, they understood what the driver was saying. There's another train ahead. But the problem was simple. That railway only had a single track. If there really was another train ahead, it meant only one thing. Two trains were heading directly toward each other. But in all the railway records, there had never been a second train. So the question remained, what exactly did the driver see that night? The investigation entered a new phase on the 6th day. Railway technical engineers were officially brought into the case. Their task was simple. Explain one thing. Why a train that had already disappeared was still appearing inside the railway control system. The engineers began by examining the dispatch control network. The Black Ridge Line used one of the more advanced railway tracking systems of that time. Every train traveling along the route would trigger track circuits that reported its position back to the central dispatch center. In simple terms, if the system showed a train passing a section of track, there was usually only one explanation. A train was actually there. But this was where the mystery deepened. System logs showed that 5 days after its disappearance, train K204 had passed through the Black Ridge Line again. Speed, 70 kilometers per hour. Time, 4:16 a.m. Duration, 2 minutes. Then the signal vanished once more. At first, engineers suspected a technical malfunction. They began inspecting every section of the track circuits along the Black Ridge Line. But the results only made the situation more confusing. Every piece of equipment was functioning normally. No short circuits. No signal interference. No hardware failures. In other words, there was no reason for the system to generate a phantom train. Investigators then proposed a different theory. Perhaps the system wasn't malfunctioning. Perhaps a signal was somehow being repeated. To test this idea, engineers retrieved the complete data logs from the night the train vanished. That was when they discovered something unsettling. 4:16 a.m. The exact moment the train driver had first reported seeing someone on the tracks, which meant every time the system detected K204 again, it was replaying the same moment. But the most disturbing discovery came during the final stage of analysis. One engineer noticed something strange. Each time the signal appeared, the train's recorded position had changed. The first signal appeared at the entrance of the Black Ridge Tunnel. The second appeared in the middle of the tunnel. The third appeared near the exit. When these signals were connected together, they formed a terrifying possibility. The vanished train seemed to be slowly moving through the entire Black Ridge Line, as if it were still traveling, just invisible. The investigation team soon realized that if the signal logs were accurate, the last known location of train K204 was most likely inside the Black Ridge Tunnel. It was an old tunnel built in the 1960s, 11 kilometers long, cutting directly through the Black Ridge Mountains. Because of its age, the tunnel's design was simple. There was only a single railway track. No switches. No side tracks. No alternative exits. In other words, once a train entered the tunnel, the only way out was the other side. The investigation team decided to conduct a second, more thorough inspection. This time, they brought specialized equipment: track scanners, metal detection systems, structural radar. If a buried train wreck existed anywhere inside the tunnel, these devices should detect it. The inspection began at the entrance. The inspection vehicle moved slowly, at only 10 kilometers per hour. Engineers recorded track conditions while examining the tunnel walls. For the first few kilometers, everything appeared normal. The rails were intact. The tunnel structure was stable. There were hardly any signs of falling rock. But when the vehicle reached the middle section of the tunnel, something unusual appeared. The track scanner suddenly detected an abnormal signal. It covered a section of rail about 50 meters long. The instrument indicated that this area had once experienced an extremely intense pressure load, as if something massive had passed over the rails within a very short moment. Yet strangely, the rails showed no visible damage, no bending, no fractures, no breaking marks. It was as if that enormous pressure had never truly existed. Engineers repeated the tests. The results remained exactly the same. At that moment, another technician noticed something even stranger. Along the tunnel wall, there was a row of unusual marks. They looked like scratches left by something moving at extremely high speed. Each mark was about 2 meters long, only a few millimeters deep. But they were arranged with unsettling precision, as if something had raced through the tunnel. The investigation team collected samples from the marks. The analysis results left everyone silent. The marks were not made by ordinary metal contact. They were traces of extremely high temperature friction. Estimated temperature: over 1,000 degrees. The problem was simple. No ordinary train could produce that kind of heat while traveling through a tunnel, unless it was not an ordinary train. At the same time, the Railway Control Center detected the K204 signal again. The time was still 4:16 a.m. Duration: 2 minutes. But this time, engineers noticed something new. At the exact moment the signal appeared, all nearby radio frequencies experienced a brief interference. Duration: 2 minutes. As if a massive energy source had suddenly appeared and then vanished. Investigators returned once again to the driver's final words: "There is another train ahead." If the driver had not been mistaken, that meant something impossible. On that single-track railway, 2 trains had existed at the same time. One of them was K204. The other came from nowhere. And according to all railway records, that second train had never existed. By the second week of the investigation, an almost forgotten lead began to surface. It came from an old railway archive. The record was buried inside a decades-old internal accident database. The first person to notice it was a young engineer working with the investigation team. While comparing historical maintenance records from the Black Ridge Line, he noticed something unusual. One entire year's data appeared incomplete. That year was 1993. Inside the system database, most operational logs from that year had vanished. Only scattered maintenance entries remained. But one detail immediately caught his attention. A train number. K204. The same number that belonged to the missing train. Under normal railway numbering rules, a train number is rarely reused within a short time period, which meant something didn't make sense. If the train that disappeared in 1995 was K204, then the appearance of the same number in 1993 was highly unusual. The investigation team requested access to older paper archives. Inside a dusty railway records room, they finally located the file. The title was simple: Black Ridge Line Train Accident Report. Date, November 1993. Train number, K204. For a moment, the entire investigation team fell silent, because this meant something extraordinary. 2 years earlier, on the same railway line, there had already been another K204. The report itself was not very long, but one section stood out immediately. According to the document, one night in November 1993, a passenger train lost communication while traveling through the Black Ridge Tunnel. Dispatch operators repeatedly attempted to contact the train. There was no response. 20 minutes later, the signal light at the far end of the tunnel suddenly reactivated. The train reappeared in the track circuit system. But when the train finally exited the tunnel, everyone on duty noticed something impossible. The train was empty. 7 entire carriages. No passengers. No crew members. Even the driver was gone. Inside the train, there were no signs of struggle. No blood. No damage. It was as if every person on board had vanished at the exact same moment. Railway authorities conducted a full search of the tunnel. They found nothing. Eventually, the incident was recorded as unexplained personnel disappearance. The train number K204 was officially retired after that event. Then 2 years later, in 1995, the number was reactivated, assigned once again to a passenger train, the same train that would later disappear. As the investigators finished reading the report, an unsettling question began to emerge. If the K204 train from 1993 had experienced something similar inside the Black Ridge Tunnel, then was the 1995 disappearance really just a coincidence? Or had something been happening inside that tunnel for a very long time? Even stranger, on the final page of the 1993 accident report, someone had written a message in red ink. There was no name, no date, only a single warning. Do not let K204 enter the Black Ridge Line again. The investigation team first realized something was wrong on the 4th night. At 11:20 p.m., only 3 people remained inside the command tent: a railway engineer, a geological expert, and the record keeper responsible for organizing the documents. 3 sets of files were spread across the table. Each one came from a different year. The first was the 1993 construction design blueprint. The second was the 1994 completion report. The third was the railway operation database record. At first glance, everything looked perfectly normal. But when the engineer placed the 3 documents on top of each other, something strange appeared. He stared at the papers for a long time. Then he slowly frowned, because the length of the tunnel did not match. In every official record, the length of Black Ridge Tunnel had always been exactly 11 kilometers. That number appeared in the railway yearbook. It appeared in the operation system, even in the train scheduling tables. 11 kilometers. Not 1 meter more, not 1 meter less. But the problem was, on the original construction blueprint, the number was different. The drawing clearly marked the length as 11.6 kilometers, 600 meters longer. For a moment, the entire tent fell silent. The engineer thought he must have made a mistake. He pulled the lamp closer and checked again. But the number did not change. The blueprint clearly stated, design length of Black Ridge Tunnel, 11,600 meters. Exactly 600 meters more than the official record. The record keeper was the first to speak. Maybe the design was changed later. The engineer shook his head. If the design had been modified, every version of the document would have been updated. And in railway engineering, tunnel length is one of the most critical parameters. It cannot simply change, especially not by 600 meters. This wasn't a small error. It was the difference between two entirely different tunnels. The geological expert then said quietly, maybe they shortened it during construction. The engineer immediately rejected the idea. A tunnel is not a bridge. You can't simply stop digging halfway through. If the design requires 11.6 kilometers, the tunnel must reach 11.6 kilometers. Otherwise, the exit would open inside solid mountain rock. That would be impossible. The air in the tent grew heavier. All three of them were thinking the same thing. If the construction blueprint was correct, then the official record was wrong. But if the official record was correct, then the blueprint was fake. Either way, one question remained. Where did the missing 600 meters go? The engineer began searching through older documents. At around 1 in the morning, he finally found something. It was a construction phase internal report. The date on the file was March 1994, just 1 month before the tunnel was completed. The report contained only 3 pages. The first page listed geological data. The second page described construction progress. The third page contained just a single sentence. That sentence had been circled in red ink. It read, an abnormal incident occurred in construction section 7. Work suspended for 72 hours. The 3 men exchanged glances, because they all knew something. Black Ridge Tunnel had been divided into 7 construction sections, and section 7 was the deepest part of the tunnel. It was also the area with the most complicated geological conditions. The engineer kept reading. At the very bottom of the report, he noticed a small handwritten note. The handwriting looked different from the rest of the document, almost like it had been added later. The sentence said, abnormal zone processed. Final tunnel length adjusted to 11,000 meters. The engineer stared at the line for a long time. The record keeper finally asked quietly, what does that mean? The engineer answered slowly, it means the tunnel was originally 11.6 kilometers, and later someone changed it to 11. The light inside the tent flickered slightly. Outside, the wind was getting stronger. The geological expert asked another question. Were those 600 meters sealed off? The engineer didn't answer, because if it had simply been sealed, the blueprints wouldn't have been altered, the records wouldn't have been erased, and the section wouldn't have disappeared from every official document. Unless the existence of those 600 meters was something that could never be officially recorded. At 2 a.m., the investigation team made a decision. They would enter the tunnel the next morning. They would measure it themselves. If the tunnel truly ended at 11 kilometers, then the problem was in the documents. But if the actual length was 11.6 kilometers, then somewhere inside that mountain tunnel, there was a section of space that had never been recorded. At 6 in the morning, the investigation convoy entered Black Ridge Tunnel. The structure of the tunnel was old. Construction marks from the early 1990s could still be seen on the walls. Measuring equipment was placed beside the tracks. The engineer marked the distance every 100 meters. The numbers were recorded carefully. The first 5 kilometers were normal. 6 kilometers. 7. 8. Everything matched the official data perfectly, until they reached the 10-kilometer mark. The engineer suddenly stopped. According to the official record, the tunnel should end 1 kilometer ahead. But the darkness continued. There was no exit, no daylight, only a railway track extending deeper into the mountain. No one spoke. The engineer glanced at the measuring device. Then he said quietly, "Keep going." They continued forward. 10.2 kilometers, 10.4 kilometers, 10.6 kilometers. The tunnel still did not end. The air became damp. Strange cracks appeared in the rock walls. 10.8 kilometers, 11 kilometers. According to the official records, they should already be outside the tunnel. But they were still inside. And then suddenly, the measuring instrument emitted a sharp signal. The engineer looked down at the screen. The number displayed was 11.6 kilometers. At that exact moment, something appeared at the end of the tunnel. It was not rock. It was not an exit. It was a massive steel door. The door had no number, no warning signs, only a heavily rusted metal plate. The engineer shone his flashlight on it for a long time before he could read the faded letters. The words on the plate said, "Construction Section 7, Restricted Area." No one in the investigation team spoke, because they suddenly understood something. The missing 600 meters had never disappeared. They had always been there. They were simply locked behind that door. And the last recorded position of train K204 was located exactly near Section 7. The investigation team stopped in front of the steel door. It was thicker than they expected. A solid metal slab welded into a concrete frame. Rust covered the edges. It looked like the door had not been opened for many years. The engineer pointed his flashlight at the locking mechanism. It was not a normal lock. It was an industrial safety lock used during railway construction. It required a special key. The problem was, no one had that key. The record keeper stared at the metal plate that read, "Construction Section 7, Restricted Area." He spoke quietly. This place never appeared in any archive. No one answered. A few minutes later, the team decided to force the door open. A crowbar slid into the narrow gap. Metal screamed as it bent. Dust fell from the frame. 10 minutes later, the door finally opened a crack. A wave of cold air slowly drifted out. It was not the air of a normal tunnel. It smelled like a long sealed underground space. The engineer pushed harder. The heavy steel door slid aside. A deep echo rolled through the darkness. Then the flashlights shone inside. Everyone froze, because behind the door, there was no tunnel. Instead, there was a massive underground chamber. The ceiling was arched. The concrete structure looked newer than the main tunnel. Old construction markings covered the walls. It looked almost like a hidden underground station. And the railway tracks continued forward into the darkness. The engineer stepped inside. Each step echoed across the empty space. 10 meters. 20. 30. Then the flashlight beam hit something. A train car. Dark green paint. The style of an old passenger train. The windows were covered with dust, as if it had been sitting there for years. Everyone stopped moving. The engineer slowly approached. The flashlight beam moved along the body. 1 car. 2 cars. 3. An entire train stood on the track. 8 carriages in total. Exactly like the passenger trains used in the early 1990s. The record keeper whispered, "Is that K204? The engineer did not answer. He pointed the flashlight toward the front of the train. A number plate was mounted near the headlight. It was almost unreadable under rust. He wiped it with his sleeve. And then, everyone saw the number. It was not K204. It was K208. Silence filled the underground chamber. Because K208 was not just any train. It had once existed, but only briefly. In railway archives, K208 was recorded as decommissioned in 1992. Reason unknown. The engineer slowly stepped back. If this was really K208, then it had been sitting here for at least 3 years. But something was even stranger. The headlights were on. Dim yellow light flickered in the chamber, as if the train still had power. But the railway system had not supplied electricity to this line for years. The record keeper spoke quietly. "Is anyone here?" No reply. Only the faint hum of electricity. The engineer walked to the first carriage door. It was closed, but not locked. He reached out and gently pulled. The door slid open with a soft sound. Inside, darkness. The flashlight beam moved through the cabin. Rows of seats, perfectly arranged. No luggage, no passengers. Like an empty train that had never carried anyone. The engineer walked deeper into the carriage. His footsteps echoed on the metal floor. Halfway down the aisle, he suddenly stopped, because something was sitting on one of the seats. An old leather suitcase, dark brown, worn at the corners, almost identical to the one police had found near the railway. The record keeper's voice trembled. That suitcase, wasn't it already taken away? The engineer didn't answer. He slowly picked it up. It felt light, almost empty. He opened it. Inside was only one thing. A train ticket. The paper had turned yellow. Printed on it was a date. The 17th of June 1995. The exact day. Train K204 disappeared. The air suddenly felt colder. Because it meant something. This train might not simply be K208. Perhaps, at some point, it had crossed paths with K204. And at that moment, a sound echoed faintly through the underground space. Far away. Very weak. It sounded like another train moving through the tunnel. Inside the underground chamber, the sound of the train was still echoing. Low, slow, heavy. The unmistakable rhythm of steel wheels grinding against rails. Everyone in the investigation team froze. They all understood one thing. According to every map and railway record, there was only one track inside this tunnel. And on the track in front of them, there was already a train. K208. If another train was approaching, that could only mean one thing. 2 trains on the same track. The only possible outcome was a head-on collision. The engineer stepped out of the carriage. He walked slowly toward the rail, shining his flashlight into the darkness ahead. The sound became clearer. Wheels turning, steel vibrating. Even the faint metallic clanks from carriage joints. It was the exact sound a passenger train makes while moving. The recorder spoke nervously. If a train is really coming. He stopped halfway through the sentence. Because everyone already knew what he meant. The sound grew closer. But something was wrong. There was no light. No headlights. No silhouette. Nothing appeared in the darkness. Then suddenly, the rail beneath their feet trembled slightly, as if a train had just passed right beside them. But they saw nothing. The sound continued moving forward, slowly fading into the distance. Within seconds, silence returned. The underground chamber became deathly quiet again. The engineer crouched down. He placed his hand on the rail. Cold steel. But moments ago, He had clearly felt the vibration, which meant only one thing. A train had passed. They simply couldn't see it. The recorder whispered, "Could there be another track?" The engineer shook his head. "There's only one." But the moment he said that, he suddenly stopped speaking, because a thought appeared in his mind. Maybe the problem wasn't the number of tracks. Maybe the problem was time. The next day, the investigation team returned with more equipment. This time they brought railway blueprints, construction maps, and archived engineering documents. They spread the papers on the ground beside the train. The engineer compared each version carefully. Soon he noticed something strange. There were 3 different blueprints for the Black Ridge Tunnel. The first version, the earliest design draft, tunnel length 11.6 kilometers. The second version, a later construction plan, tunnel length 11.2 kilometers. The third version, the officially approved final design, tunnel length 11 kilometers. The recorder frowned. Why does it keep getting shorter? The engineer didn't answer, because he had just noticed something even stranger. On the first blueprint, near the center of the tunnel, there was a marked structure. He leaned closer with the flashlight. It showed a double track section, 2 parallel rail lines. But next to it, there was a handwritten note. The handwriting had almost faded away. A technician photographed it and enhanced the image. Eventually, they managed to read the words. It said, "Time interference test section." No one spoke for a long time, because in railway engineering, there had never been a term like that. The recorder finally asked quietly, "What does that even mean?" The engineer slowly replied, "I don't know." But deep inside, he had a terrible feeling. This tunnel might once have been used for some kind of experiment. On the third day, they decided to measure the tunnel themselves. The engineer carried a distance meter, starting from the sealed door area. He walked deeper into the tunnel. He wanted to know one thing: the true length of the tunnel. The device began recording distance. 100 meters, 500 meters, 1 kilometer, 3 kilometers. Everything looked normal. But when the reading reached 5.8 kilometers, the device suddenly malfunctioned. Numbers flickered. Signals broke. The engineer stopped, reset the device, then continued forward. 6 kilometers, 6.2 kilometers. Then they saw something. Beside the track, there stood an old railway marker. It read, K204, 6 kilometers. The recorder stared at it, because according to official records, train K204 should never have passed through this section. At that moment, the radio communicator suddenly crackled. The dispatch center was calling them. The voice sounded tense. "Where are you right now?" The engineer replied, "Inside the middle section of Black Ridge Tunnel." The radio fell silent for 2 seconds. Then the dispatcher said something that made everyone's spine go cold. "The system has just detected the signal of train K204 again." "Location?" the engineer asked. The answer came immediately. "Right in front of you." The engineer slowly lifted his head. He looked into the darkness ahead. There was nothing there. But at that exact moment, far in the distance, a faint light appeared, like a weak locomotive headlamp. It moved slowly through the darkness, growing brighter, getting closer. The recorder's voice trembled. "Is that a train?" The engineer didn't answer, because a terrifying realization had just formed in his mind. The track beneath their feet was indeed only one rail line. But at certain moments, it might become two. One belonged to the present. The other belonged to another time. Train K204 might never have disappeared. It might still be running on that other time track. And every night, at exactly 4:16 a.m., the two timelines briefly overlapped. That was why the railway system kept detecting its signal. That was why patrol workers heard train sounds, but saw nothing on the tracks. And now, standing in the tunnel, they were only a few hundred meters away from that invisible track. The distant light was getting brighter. The rails began to vibrate. The familiar sound filled the tunnel again. Steel wheels, grinding rails, metal shaking through the darkness. The unseen train was approaching, and its number was only one: K204. The investigation team stood deep inside the Black Ridge Tunnel. No one spoke, because the light they had seen earlier had vanished, as if it had never existed. But everyone knew they had truly seen a train. It had not passed them, and it had not collided with the stationary K208. It had simply traveled along an invisible track. The engineer finally broke the silence. "We need to confirm something. Where exactly is train K204? The next day, the team returned to the command center. They began reorganizing every record connected to the missing train. Radio transmissions, emergency calls, railway signals. All of them were placed along a massive timeline wall. Hours passed. Then a technician suddenly noticed something strange. It was a phone record from October 1996. The mysterious call received by a passenger's family. At the time, police believed it was a prank. But now, they played the recording again. The background noise was intense, like a train moving at high speed. Rails vibrating, carriages rattling, wind rushing past the windows. Then a man's voice appeared. Weak, distorted by static. "We are still on the train." The team replayed the audio again and again. Suddenly, the technician spoke. "Wait. This call might not be what we think." He pulled up the communication data. Call time, signal origin, system timestamp. Everything was there. He pointed at a single line on the screen. The call was received in October 1996. But the signal was sent. He zoomed in. The timestamp became clear. The 17th of October 1995, 4:21 a.m. The entire room fell silent. Because that was the exact morning the train disappeared. The technician continued. "The system shows the signal was sent in 1995. But it was received in 1996. Someone immediately said, "That's impossible. System error." But the engineer shook his head. Railway communication systems don't make mistakes like that. They checked telecom provider records. The data matched perfectly. Signal origin: Black Ridge Tunnel. Send time: the 17th of October 1995. Receive time: October 1996. Slowly, a terrifying realization spread across the room. The call had not come from the future. It had come from the past. The passengers of K204 had been calling for help. But their call had reached the outside world. 1 year later, no one spoke for a long time, because the implication was horrifying. If the records were correct, then time inside the tunnel was not flowing the same way as outside. The engineer finally shared his theory. Suppose the tunnel really contains two time tracks, one belonging to the present, the other belonging to the past. If a train enters the second track, its time flow might change. The technician quickly calculated the numbers. From 1995 to 1996. 1 full year had passed in the real world. But the timestamp on the call was only 5 minutes after the train lost contact, which meant something unbelievable for the passengers on K204. They entered the tunnel, saw the mysterious train, tried to call for help, and for them, only a few minutes had passed. But outside the tunnel, a whole year had gone by. Someone quietly asked, "So where are they now?" No one answered, because if the theory was true, train K204 might still be moving on that hidden time track. The passengers might still be inside, still trying to call for help, still believing rescue would arrive soon. But they had no idea that the world outside their train had already moved 1 year ahead. Then the technician discovered another record. Just yesterday, the railway system had detected another signal. Origin: train K204. Time: 4:16 a.m. Signal duration: 2 minutes. Then it vanished. The engineer stared at the screen. If our theory is correct, the train never stopped. It's still moving on another timeline. Every morning at 4:16, the two tracks briefly overlap. That's why we can detect the signal. Silence filled the room again. Because if that was true, then somewhere inside the Black Ridge Tunnel, on a track no one could see, train K204 might still be traveling forward. And for the passengers on board, time might still be frozen at one moment. The 17th of October 1995. 12 days after the K204 signal appeared again, the investigation team held an emergency meeting. Over the past several days, engineers had reanalyzed every piece of signal data collected during the past year. They discovered something almost impossible to explain. The signal from train K204 did not appear randomly. It always appeared at exactly the same time, 4:16 a.m. The margin of error was never more than 3 seconds. This meant only one thing. At that exact moment, something in the structure of the tunnel was repeating with perfect stability. One of the engineers proposed a bold theory. If the Black Ridge Tunnel truly contained 2 time tracks, then every day at 4:16 a.m., those tracks might briefly overlap. The overlap might last only seconds, perhaps less than a minute. But during that short window, 2 different layers of time could temporarily connect. In other words, at that moment, the real world and the timeline where train K204 existed might share the same space. A doorway between 2 timelines. At first, many people dismissed the idea. But the signal data could not be ignored. For nearly an entire year, the K204 signal had appeared at almost the exact same time, 4:16 a.m. Like a clock that never failed. Eventually, the investigation team made a decision. They would enter the tunnel. The attempt would take place at exactly 4:16 a.m. It was an extremely dangerous operation. No one knew what would happen if they stepped into that second track. More importantly, no one knew if a human being could ever return from it. But without trying, the mystery of train K204 would remain unsolved forever. The mission was scheduled 3 days later. 6 members joined the expedition. 2 railway engineers, 2 physics researchers, 1 police officer, and a tunnel construction specialist. They brought every device capable of recording data. Radio transmitters, precision time recorders, signal capture equipment, multiple cameras. At 3:40 a.m., they entered the Black Ridge Tunnel. It was the exact time when train K204 had entered the tunnel a year earlier. The tunnel was silent. The air smelled damp and cold. Far ahead, the steel rails reflected pale white light from their flashlights. They walked slowly forward. Everyone was waiting. The time moved closer. 4:10 a.m. Nothing happened. 4:14 a.m. The radio equipment began producing faint static. The engineers immediately began recording. 4:15 a.m. Suddenly, the rails began to vibrate. It was not imagination. Everyone felt it. The vibration was weak but unmistakable, like a train moving somewhere far away. The members of the team looked at each other. No one spoke. 4:16 a.m. The radios erupted in a burst of intense static. Then something appeared in the distance. A light. It looked exactly like the headlight of a train. Everyone froze, because the rails in front of them were completely empty. Yet the light kept growing brighter, as if an invisible train was rushing straight toward them. Suddenly, one of the engineers shouted, "The signal! It's appearing!" On the signal receiver screen, a familiar code flashed. K204. In that moment, every member of the team realized something terrifying. They might have just found the track that should not exist. The light kept getting closer. The vibration along the rails grew stronger. Every member of the investigation team stood frozen. No one stepped back, because they all understood something. If that really was train K204, then the place where they were standing was exactly where the train had passed 1 year earlier. 4:16 a.m. Suddenly, the vibration intensified. It felt like a high-speed train rushing directly past them. Yet the most disturbing part was this. They still could not see anything. Only air. Only steel rails. Only the growing brightness of the approaching light. Then something even stranger happened. The cameras began recording automatically. On the monitor screens, a train slowly appeared. Its shape formed from static. An old passenger train. And on the front of the locomotive, a number was clearly visible. K204. But the strange part was this. To the naked eye, nothing existed. Only the cameras could capture it. As if the train did not exist in their time, but in another layer of time. Suddenly, the radio crackled. A burst of heavy static filled the air. Behind the noise, the sound of a moving train could be heard. Then a man's voice appeared. "Dispatch center, can you hear me?" Everyone froze. The voice sounded incredibly clear, like a normal radio transmission. But within seconds, they realized something terrifying. That voice belonged to the original driver of K204. One of the engineers quickly checked the recording device. The timestamp appeared on the screen. The 17th of October 1995. 4:16 a.m. Exactly 1 year earlier. Which meant something impossible. The radio transmission they were hearing was not a new signal. It was the past, happening in real time. At that moment, the camera image suddenly became clearer. The windows of the train appeared. Inside the dimly lit carriages, people were sitting. Passengers, conductors, even children. They all looked normal. Some were sleeping. Some were looking out the windows. Some were quietly talking. No one seemed aware of anything unusual. It looked like a perfectly ordinary night train. Then suddenly, one child lifted his head, as if he heard something. The child slowly walked toward the window and looked outside into the tunnel. Then he froze, because from his perspective, 6 figures were standing outside the train. The investigation team. The child's eyes widened. Then he spoke. The exact same sentence that investigators had heard on the radio many times during the past year. "Don't come closer." In that moment, every member of the investigation team realized something terrifying. Train K204 had never disappeared. It had simply become trapped on another track of time. The tunnel slowly fell silent again. The light disappeared. The vibrations stopped. It was as if nothing had ever happened. The rails stretched quietly into the darkness. No one in the investigation team spoke. They were all staring at the camera monitor. The final frame remained frozen on the screen. The child's face. And the words he spoke. "Don't come closer." The engineers carefully checked the equipment. They confirmed something important. The footage captured by the cameras was not a malfunction. It was not interference. It was real. A train. A train existing on another timeline. By the time the investigation team left the tunnel, it was already morning. But the story had not ended. In fact, it was only beginning. That night, a sealed archive file was delivered to the head investigator. It was an old internal document from the railway system. File number 1993-X-17. The title contained only one sentence: Black Ridge Time Interference Test. The investigator opened the file. The first page described an engineering project. According to the records, in 1993, the railway department had partnered with a research institute to conduct a classified experiment inside the Black Ridge Tunnel. The goal was simple: to study the effect of high-speed electromagnetic fields on time signals. A large electromagnetic generator system was installed deep inside the tunnel. In theory, it could create extremely strong signal distortions for very short periods of time. At first, this was only a communications experiment. They wanted to improve railway signal reliability in mountainous regions. But during the third phase of testing, researchers discovered something impossible. Time recordings began to shift. Certain radio signals appeared several seconds earlier than expected. At first, they believed it was an equipment error, but the distortion kept increasing. Seconds, tens of seconds, then minutes, until one day, the recorder captured something extraordinary. A radio transmission from the future. The timestamp of the signal was 3 minutes ahead of real time. The experiment was immediately terminated. The equipment was sealed. All records were classified. But the story did not truly end. Because 2 years later, in 1995, train K204 entered the Black Ridge Tunnel at exactly 4:16 a.m. And on that day, the experimental equipment was still buried deep inside the tunnel. No one knew whether it was still active. The investigation team sat in silence. Finally, someone asked quietly, if the system activated at that exact moment, what would happen? One of the engineers slowly answered, a time track. He pointed toward the tunnel. The train may have entered a distorted segment of space-time. In there, time may flow at a completely different speed. Someone asked quietly, what about the passengers? The engineer paused. Then he replied, if our theory is correct, they may have only experienced a few minutes. No one spoke again, because they all understood the implication. In the real world, an entire year had passed. But inside that train, time may still be stuck at the 17th of October 1995, 4:16 a.m. After that investigation, the Black Ridge Tunnel was permanently sealed. The railway line was rerouted. The official report stated only one sentence: signal system malfunction. There was no mention of the experiment, no mention of the time track, and no mention of train K204. But even today, railway maintenance workers sometimes report something strange. Late at night, while inspecting the abandoned tracks, they occasionally hear a sound deep within the tunnel. It is distant, faint, like a train moving through darkness. And if you happen to stand near that abandoned railway at exactly 4:16 a.m., you might hear the faint vibration of steel rails, the sound of wheels grinding against metal, as if a train is passing right beside you. But when you shine your flashlight onto the tracks, you will only see empty rails, and somewhere on another track of time, train K204 may still be traveling through that dark tunnel.